I love to admire. I love to admire perseverance in my students. I love to admire the character and the path of my former students in their own lives. I love to admire my own children's path in their own lives. I find that it's very important to be filled with convictions, would it be by experience or by intuition, but to remain always so tolerant, truly so, about different ways of conceiving the things that you grow to believe you know. And I don't only admire people I know, but I admire also different ways of thinking the world than mine. I find it very important that every day, and in my age they're lesser, has to be meaningful in the sense of doing the best for what one is called to do, and never accept to think that every day is the copy of the preceding day with some kind of a routine, which is reassuring, but unfortunately I think that we need to consider, at least I do, and I don't impose to anybody to do, that each lesson I give is the only lesson. Each performance I give is the only performance, in the sense that it's the summary of all what I've become, from what I've received to what through what I lived, in order to be that hyphen for the student, for the child, for the next generation. Passing forward, not the nostalgia of the past, that is for inner garden, but passing forward the universality of the message that I received, in order to be the useful ingredient from which, among others, people's opinions, my students, my children, my descendants, spiritually, so to say, will nourish themselves from, to become who they are. And they already are who they were before I meet them, before my children was born, and then when my son or my daughter were born, I realized that they've always been, not that I had remembered how it was before. Of course I lived before, and same with the students. Isn't self-evidence that the fierce energy of the present brings us to put in certain distance irrationally the past from the future. It's some kind of a perhaps professional deformation as a musician, because I'm constantly in a time-traveling machine, spiritually and intellectually, about bringing the music of the past in the present. But in fact, the music is always in its present. That present is its eternal youth, freshness. You can explain, you can organize, you can analyze, you can develop concepts, and then there are layers and there are fusions of elements in the things that we seem to grow to know with age and experience, which reveal themselves differently, or perhaps all of a sudden, by almost inadvertence, you realize the whole picture of what this piece is about, or what the teacher used to tell you it's supposed to be. Because intellectually you can apply a lot as a student of desire to succeed in order to be appreciated for the effort, intellectual, physical, and character-wise, to practice, to improve, to never accept to have reached a plateau. And ultimately you do it for yourself. Of course you do it to please perhaps a parent, a family, a spouse, a friend, I don't know, a teacher, possibly. And that is a good drive, horizon line to try to reach. But ultimately, and constantly, probably more than ultimately, you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, so what did I really accomplish from what I thought I should have, for what I think, what I serve? Would it be a text, a thought, a composition, an organization of sounds? All this appears to be so vain, but in fact, it is important, and that's why I think admiration is part of humility, and it's not part of insecurity. On the contrary, I think I try to remind myself in every single day, for every single lesson that I give, regardless how many. It's like I think of the cantatas of Bach. Each is so individual, while of course they have commonalities in their toolbox, and the fact that they were produced craftsmanship-like. I wouldn't like to say industrially, because it's really not the right word, not respectful. Or Haydn's symphonies, or all these composers who, by survival necessities, had to, like Vivaldi, produce such plethora of music, and they manage, even if we can say, oh, they all sound alike, their pieces, or the Scarlatti sonatas, but not. Of course, there are little things here and there that you can learn by observing them and comparing them and contrasting them, but in reality, what is really humbling is that they didn't succumb to the facility to reproduce really everything constantly once they learn their trade. There is this kind of, and of course, unfortunately, these are the famous ones, in the sense that there's so many composers of every period of the past that we serve, who are either forgotten, either less played, less heard, less thought of, less taught, either because whatever reasons brought them to be in side lines of history. So many of them were creators in the craftsmanship of their technique, was the capacity to deepen variety of different ways to look at the same essence, in sense of the music is of course language, communication, escapism, reflection, brings us to entertain as well as to philosophize, and why not both? So there is inevitably music written by obligation for a purpose, either to glorify a monarch, or to glorify a faith, and to work towards a conviction about humanity. So you have the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven and its humanistic message, but you also have pieces that appear not to have a message, that don't have specifically perhaps some kind of essential importance in the history of the music world, but they are like so meaningful. To me, all of them are meaningful. No hierarchy, no small masters, only sincere masters. Masters because through a technique they manage to bring us closer to the humanity in all of us. Of course, you learn the style, the specific performance practice, the system in which their music was in their own present. Today it's in our own present with different instruments, hearing, projecting, broadcasting, podcasting. The means of connecting the pieces and their message to us pedagogically, artistically, or just entertainingly, and all of these elements are part of the incredible quality and desire to craft well what they were doing with their own convictions. And then you have composers like Schubert and some composers, others, and I know quite a few, who don't have commissions, who don't have to survive by their music, who don't write film music or music for video games, commercials, as essential to the society of today and to the creativity of today. They just write music for some kind of a inner garden, you know, like they do it because they need to, and therefore the plethora of people who learn a trade to exist without any substance about it, other than because they're intelligent and smart, more than intelligent, to appear that they have what it takes, but in fact they're shallow. And it's self-evident to themselves, but the technique and the systems of the complexities of the music languages evolutions or spreadings in so many directions baffles so much the musicians or the music lovers or just simply the humans that they manage to appear more important because they want to be than the essence of what they do is, or what they leave after them as their work. It's presumptuous to decide who is worthy of the history of music's pantheon and who is not. I find that we will never have of a lifetime enough to be honoring the comrades of the past who slipped in the cracks of history. And I don't believe in the fact that there is a reason for which they're less well known, either because they are not good, either because they are not enough original compared to others who are more revolutionary or changing the tide. I don't think you can define, or you should define, the meaning of a value of an artwork by its revelation away from its tradition. It could be within the tradition, and it could be that the necessity of the, like Beethoven in music, Picasso in painting, Stravinsky actually also in music, are composers who, musicians, artists, and there's so many writers too, who question the status quo because they simply cannot be in it. They are like Scriabin also. They are profoundly seeking something, perhaps not clearly right away and perhaps never, but when they do, they reach it. And others are just in the flow of the things, of the flow of the events. Their creativity in their sincerity doesn't necessitate to rethink the will. And that is another style of admiration that I have for people like Mozart in music, Schubert, Gershwin, many who in fact didn't really learn much other than they observed and they felt, and they are driven by a capacity to transform the dailiness into something special. Every song of a Schubert, every symphony of Schubert, every string quartet, quintet of Schubert, just like Mozart in chamber music, both, they, especially even more so Schubert, who didn't have commissions, who didn't have premieres, who was never even performed for any of his operas or masses, regardless if people can say, yes, it's because they weren't good. But I don't believe that. I believe that, of course, it's in the eye of the beholder, and then there is a trend, and there is a hierarchy that is imposed by art historians, our music scholars, who makes us, especially when we study, glide through the core repertoires for the arias of a singer, the fugues of an early music scholar, the genres, the instruments, and everywhere you go in a niche, in fact, it's its own ecosystem that has, it's like a black hole in the universe. It's somehow endless, at least not viewable end. Depth, elevation spiritually through an incredible depth of the intelligence, intuitive or intellectual. I don't oppose ever the fact that one can be partly, say, emotional intelligence or rational organization of thoughts. I think intelligence in everything conceived, from an interior design tool to a conception about understanding astronomy in ways that are hints of hints that gives them the capacity to describe things at levels that the human brain can't even really comprehend, other than be bedazzled. And from the micro to the macro of all these situations where the human mind is driven by curiosity, by desire, by perhaps avidity, possibly all of that. It is impossible not to admire people who place their thoughts at levels for the extreme past possible, or imagine the future possible or impossible. And then the trends of the day in comparison, where the robotization, the artificial intelligence, the idea that human is so failing in their shortcomings, and societally organized as well, that robots inevitably are tireless and moralless and just even more obedient than slaves. And I think about these things a lot, because I find that I admire when in each time period of history there are people who think humanistically with their own spiritual upliftings and their faith. It's not incompatible, to the contrary. My thoughts seem scattered when I speak to you like this, but they're hyphenated by an invisible thread that is that admiration, or that capacity to admire, that capacity to be, no matter how old able to be enchanted, charmed, seduced by an art form's gesture that reveals to you something of the grace of the existence, of the creation, of the being. Of course, we all constantly wonder forever, since ever probably, about the why, the how long, and the till when, obviously, because it's part of the how long. So therefore, it's easy to refuge oneself in the dailiness of the present. And it's not an escapism only to imagine those things in daydreams. Of course, some people have the means to implement their daydreams, and for good or bad, it becomes ideological, then it becomes industrial, then it becomes an industry that brings trends and trends, and people believe or depend of it, and you have to always be, if not a step ahead, at least a few, to not be constantly behind and lagging. When a student brings me a piece I have studied since I was a, let's say, youngster, child, whatever, I don't try to imprint on them what I've learned that this piece represents compared to what it meant to me and my own path in life with that piece, with its the time it takes through doing other things, and perhaps because of doing other things, to reveal itself to you in its perhaps invisible part of the iceberg, that brought to be what you fell in love musically with when you discovered it, if you did. And it's not because you can explain it throughout, like a music theory or historian or any scholar of music, that you like it more. It's just that because you love it so much, you're attracted to it. But there is always a part of mystery that shouldn't be the point of explaining. This modulation creates this mood, this atmosphere is there because of the harmonic progression, which in fact taken by itself, it's nothing but a synergy of elements in a certain layering combination. I mean, it's true. It's more about when, as you practice on the piano sections, to master them best, and then you align them to get to play through the piece. That doesn't mean that you have constructed this ephemeral structure of the piece that you build every time you play from the beginning, from scratch, since it evaporates as soon as finished played. It's again that invisible thread idea that is an intuition. You feel it. You cannot really name it. It's like the soul. You feel you have one, but you cannot locate it. And because it's not for others as well, you connect to their souls more than to their gazes, bodies, or personalities. Of course, some are to be admired, some are desired, some are perhaps even rejected because one finds that this or that person has ways that make your own ways just react negatively. And I find that when a student sees in a piece that I've lived with for so many decades as a performer, a teacher, or whatever form of musicianship, companionship with the masterpiece, pretending perhaps too early to understand, perhaps pretending also a false humility to say, I'll never understand it fully. Perhaps it's in between. It's not fully none and fully all. It's fluctuating, and possibly you reach temporary truths. which you grab on, especially if it's your own music, because you know when it's not constantly, but when it comes out of you from some inner reminiscence, be it or whatever time of period of the past, layers of one's subconscious levels, who knows how many layers, like a dream that you barely remember, or a story that happened to you that most people told you that they remember when you were too young to remember yourself. Somehow, what drives you to choose a specific order of pitches and rhythmic values, and then learn how to notate them more or less, hopefully more than less, unfiltered, but just coming out is in the flow of the compositional event, is the storytelling or the soundtrack of life that it is. And that is the moment where you feel like you know, mostly intuitively, every path that you shouldn't go into the next musical sentence after the first that you wrote, or first idea, or first leitmotif, theme, whatever you call it. It intrigues you, and you want to know more, except it's not written by somebody else. It has to be written by you in order to discover the inner path that you unveil. And when you are almost sure that you're on the right track, you might go side, because in ways you're influenced by what you play, what you hear. You don't live in a bubble away from the musical world in which you evolve. And then you let these things influence you, and so your music will never be purely yours. It's anyway not. It's the result of some kind of communal sedimentation of centuries. You just happen to be voicing it somehow, if you can, or bringing it to image, or sculpting it from the material that is raw, and then it depends how people hear it, or see it, or perceive it. And the more they are knowing and learning about, like watching a painting with an art historian, at some point you see more in it than you thought you even wanted to. And it's a very delicate balance not to overweight the student with my own opinion, and guide the student for the truths that I believe are right about the choices of the artistic and aesthetic and stylistic frame for the interpretation, and then all the tools for the technique, how to reach it, for them to be reliable, because you don't play the piano, you play all the pianos, and you have to be able to restitute, or at least hope to, or have the ambition to, all the subtleties of the details and the whole picture as well, on any instrument responding with an action that is irresponsive, or heavily, or half responsive, and then you have the acoustics, then you have the human factor, the intelligence, the rational, but also the reserve, the psyche, the way to feeling comfortable sharing something as intimate with people whom you don't know, especially those who have to judge you, because you have to go through juries, auditions, competitions, to prove yourself professionally through life that you're worth what people are supposed to remunerate you for, if you're good at it, if you're meaningfully involved in it, and if you have the drive to pursue it. In other words, you're judged by peers. You're judged by people who perhaps don't have your point of view, far from there, of the same elements that you serve, that you teach, that you play, that they don't have the same understanding of the meaning of it. And that can judge you for being wrong in their opinion. And since it's a very subjective field, unlike science, in art, it's a charismatic situation that brings you to accept a given artwork that is like a perfume. It vehicles so many imaginations when you smell. It's like a smile, a gaze, actor who did this or that in a film, and the plot, the making, the special effects, the music, all these technologies put together like in ancient days opera, where you married all the arts work in Italian opera for the acting, the dancing, the singing, the set designing, all this. But sometimes it's just the hint from a charismatic gaze in the midst of all this that remains in your heart is what attracted you or what you kept from this, and you want to reread the book, re-see the film, go again and practice again the piece because you want to manage to play it to the way that it satisfies your desire for it and also your ambition to manage to perhaps get there. I don't think ambition is negative as often portrayed. I think it's a necessary desire to move yourself from your regular status quo place, or perhaps accept to rethink that the size of the scope of the things that you serve, let's say in music, should not be limited or, let's say, shrunk through the filter of your own psyche or your own way of understanding the things. Because ultimately, we are a hyphen between the work, which is already a hyphen from the artist who created it, and the work on its own. It's a benefit to humanity. And the artwork, would it be a video game or a philosophic book or any form of human intelligence that creates something which inspires or drives or informs others at different levels, and most of the time not the one level or other level that you expect it to be when you write a treatise about this and that, because while you have to be technically very precise and know what you do, because that is why also people trust your knowledge, you still have to think that there are other ways to combine these elements. And it's an anecdotic fact, when students misread a note and they play it with a conviction like the other notes which they didn't misread in a piece, it's self-evident that I have to say, hey, come on, why didn't you read the note? Didn't you notice? Weren't you attentive? Don't you understand the harmonic progression? Couldn't have you guessed? Couldn't have you been more eagle attentive, more concentrated, more focused, like good proofreaders for editions, which is very hard? Because the level of consistent concentration, while you need to repetitively practice until, in pianists especially in solitude, to have some kind of drive towards some kind of goal which seems to be so elusive that they gave up, or then therefore they give up all the way through, or they give up their focused attention, and then it's only the cognitive memory that allows you to go through the piece as a routine. And then you distract yourself, in fact, from the essence of the meaning for what you do, because it's so much to do to reach so little, and then you add another level of knowledge, and then it erases itself by the dailiness of it. It doesn't always accumulate, and you feel like the short-term goals escape you, the long-term goals elude you, and the competition is fierce. People seem to learn better and faster and successfully, and have they seem to be more mature, or perhaps they appear to the competitive fields, competitors, to be more confident, and perhaps On their own, they're not, but seen by their competitors, they are. And because they're placed in these situations of constant competition, from which, since it's an art after all, the subjectivity creates inevitably unfairnesses. People who have a lot to say artistically, but perhaps didn't have the technique at the moment where they were judged to prove it, would either blossom later when these elements come to conjunction, or unfortunately, they might be the ones who go by the sideways of history. Of course, they're not aware of it themselves. It's we who, with a certain, I guess, attitude towards the musicians of the centuries past, we create this narrative through history of music, these clusters of musicians in this time period that innovated this because of that, and how not in other cases. But this enormous plethoric army of people who are not acknowledged and who contributed in their time, paradoxically, if you look at the times of composers we serve in the past, their own pantheons had names which today are gone, away from the limelight. And so when I say these things, it can appear like childish, and I assume that fully, to be so sentimental about all humans. No, of course you do, and you make choices. You place your affections in a person whom you hope to receive it in return, and hardly always works. But the same happens also with an author, with a playwright writer, with a composer, with a painter, with a filmmaker, with a video game creator, with a scientist, with the capacity of the human spirit to do such ugly things to each other by insecurity or jealousy or basically existential shock, because inevitably, no matter how we behave in society, within ourselves we feel the clock ticking. And that can be earlier detected than later for some in life, and it can drive them to become incredibly jealous, angry, and needing that as a shield to protect themselves. Because if I say, as I do, I admire a lot and I place my affections in people who either can't return them, even if they're alive, let less when they're dead, that I have as imaginary conversations with the authors whom I serve or whom I teach, serving by teaching, meaning, or playing directly, or conducting, or trying to compose the essence of an emotion or a thought and combine them, or all these things are it's not because it's an attitude. I'm not more tolerant than another. I don't pretend to be more than I really am. I don't pretend to be more humble than I really am. And the level of balance in this questioning oneself art form, the live music making, brings us constantly to this roller coaster between having enough confidence without arrogance. Because at some point it makes us believe that others are dumber. And I personally have never thought in this hierarchy ever, since a child prodigy when I used to be, or now that I'm an old man. Never. That never occurred to my thought. But I know people think in these terms. I hear people tell me things like this about others. Perhaps they tell it about me to others. And that's true. I can read it on the social media too when I post something. Fine. It's their right. I smile, I don't laugh. I'm sometimes hurt, like all of us are in their self confidence. Not that we lose it, but. And we don't do things to be only credited by the other's opinion of ourselves. We have to know somehow that if I teach this class, I want to bring these concepts and this knowledge and these thoughts which will help the students become teachers in turn and in their own way develop it differently or further. Okay, that's for the intellectual property, intellectual transmission. And then there's the technical knowledge of how to make it, how to play a trill, how to play a repeated note, how to play melodic repeated note inside the key before it's lifted, and how you play without pedal or with pedal and why, and how the resonance plays with that, because inevitably, like a mother tongue, the baby at the birth hears sounds, and there is a sensorial pleasure of the sounds before they become phonemes and words and through syllables, concepts and thoughts. They're just sounds which are sensorial pleasures, and same with the pitches in music and the consonances, dissonances, which of course vary according to the time periods, just like architecture's embellishments or lack of evolve with the styles, or the necessities, the techniques and the technologies that allowed to build skyscrapers compared to when they couldn't, or when they did, it was the highest in the world, and today it seems silly, not tall. But if you take it for itself, you respect it, you admire it for them managing it, and so, or having managed it. It's easy to mock, it's easy to criticize, it's easy to reject, it's easy to say, oh, I know better, or at least I can back it up with my tradition, my awareness, and then it's all about me, right? No, it's all about the art that we serve, the muse, beyond even the composers who wrote them. I mean, obviously, if you're a good musicologist, you understand better the context of the birth of a given piece. You can do that with garden landscaping in history of times. You can do that with philosophy of thinking the world according to the different time periods and weather situations where they are allowed to think differently, because somehow the environment inevitably brought them to bring their own myths to different types of ways of doing. All these things are the quest of humanity to individually and as a group, sometimes destructively and sometimes positively, try to reach some kind of perhaps it's not innate to be as a human admirer of the others and tolerant of the other's difference. And it's easy to say, difficult to do. It takes 5 minutes to figure out, a whole life long to implement it or master even the way of being, let less the way of doing, and the way of contributing. And of course, it would be presumptuous to want to have counted in the field in which you work in order to have apparently not lost your time professionally. But if meanwhile, let's say you did lose your time, you came up with the wrong theorem, you came with the wrong understanding about the black holes in the celestial situations, and or somebody questions you and you feel like you're delegitimated because after all, you thought you believed, and then you understand from a student who brings you the same piece that in fact there is another way, another path, another way to enter into this mystery of the piece, which either they do intuitively, either because, I don't know, they figured it out somehow by hearing somebody else, or combined. And what do you do then? You say, my value is lessened, I'm worthless, I've been wrong all my life, I misunderstood the right way of approaching this or that way of thinking, that way of organizing, that way of teaching it even. I always think about that in teaching, because in the generation that was mine, of the teachers who were mine, who were inevitably, in my personal case, few generations even before mine, as unlike logically one generation distance, which is sort of what we see in pedagogical transmission. But that is more than a mindset difference, more than a, on the surface, anecdotic sort of misfitting with the time. In the deep trends, you realize that, at least I do, that pedagogically my teachers would disapprove of the way I teach. When, as I said, the student makes a wrong note because they misread it, but it sounded right, and it still does. It could have been, in a way, it could have been an option the composer could have taken. I like to encourage without to only thematize their mistake, though I like very much that approach. It's a personal intuition. It's just not a conviction or any kind of treatise I learned about it to inspire myself to do. Perhaps it's just my character, my personality. But put it all together, I don't know why, but I think that it brings the students to feel more confident that they are co-creators through the interpretation, not because they play a different note from the one intended, or we hope that was intended according to the authentic editions. But more than that is that they feel that they're legitimate to have misguessed it, while you tell them but wrong. And after all, if we are to guess the composer, and then what happens is that when you see what the composer wrote, where you would have guessed what they would have done, is it a repeat, a recapitulation, or anything, or a type of transition, or how they organize the flow of their storytelling narrator, I find that we're constantly, if not surprised always, because it's impossible constantly, but we're marveled, we are bedazzled, we are amazed by the why of the spicing of this element with a, let's say, foreign note of the tonality if it's tonal, and then not in the other place where you would expect it to happen. Therefore, the composers have the right, by their own, whatever choice, intelligence or intuition of their own, choice of a tonality, if it's not connected to an instrument for the technique of playing, then perhaps they can't even give us the explanation of some of their choices. But we're not here to guess their intents. We're here to understand with their notation what ultimately they left us with, which is it's like in a theater play, it's like in a writing that, or a painting, or any form of art. It's given to us to either misread, misunderstand, or partially understand, or then have some teacher who helps us reveal it. But we have to finalize that revelation by our own. It cannot be just a spoon feeding from the teacher to the student. I don't believe in that at all. And the fact that pedagogically I don't encourage students to misread. I give examples of options that composers could have developed their thought differently or predictably, and sometimes logic is part of it, and sometimes within the symmetry there are little details that are asymmetrical, which don't appear right away, but when you realize them, you just realize that it's like alchemy. The composer knew exactly where to place this spice to get that taste to this final. It's like a cook who makes the exact ingredient proportion combination to reach a sauce that has that specific taste towards the aim to it. And of course, in the test buds of people who test it, it tastes different according to their own glands and system, and not finding it salty enough or not sweet enough or not whatever. It's never what you intend that people receive. And when a student intends intensely to do something and I don't find it convincing and I mention it, this should be more this, they say, but it's exactly what I was intending. Didn't it go through? And so it's a moment of disbelief of the student. And me as a teacher, I feel like, oh my God, they'll feel like inevitably, no matter what, their intentions sort of like are diluted, like sandcastle in the beach by the wave. So am I to judge them to the levels of which they have to be convincing me? I'm only me. I'm not all the other musicians who teach these pieces, who know them differently and who can agree to disagree if they're collegial, as I am very much for, while some are more judgmental and rejecting and consider that there is a wrong and a right. Perhaps within my inner world I do believe that too. But I think that I help the student develop a capacity of kinship with the text rather than just the fear of betraying it by missing a detail or misplacing or misplaying a detail. Of course, all the details are important. They're not interchangeable. But if the student was brought to the point to where they practiced it for a week between lessons repetitively, and it never sounded wrong to them, even if they hear it in recordings of others, they don't detect it because their own, I think, intuitive musicianship, meaning their what people call gift or drive or some kind of affinity for a form of art, brought them to not only misread because they did, but they're in denial of misreading it since, well, of course, it can happen that some scores have also misprints, that's true. But if it's not the case, I like to show the students from which point they had to go forward once they understand this was not right, because they have to also then learn to not only accept, of course they have to because it's factually, the fact that they have to correct it, but they have to believe in it. And not only the detail, by the whole sentence of the composer's statement through the piece, not even their own, the composer, but the piece itself. Because how can a performer, an actor, an artist in general be convincing if they're not convinced? It's not just reciting somebody else's texts. It's a temporary appropriation of this by yourself. Perhaps that's what is a problem, because if the funnel of our appropriation is too tight, we lose a lot of the things that perhaps we discover in the piece as we advance in age. We call it wisdom, we call it experience. Perhaps it's a little bit true after all. Didn't always find that to happen, but sometimes it does. It happens when you start understanding the aesthetic worlds of the ecosystems of the music language, of the philosophical language of a given author. And then it's like an acquired second language by the book compared to the intuitive ear learning mother tongue of a baby. And it's a different level. So you can approach music intuitively and just played by ear, so to say. And then when you study it and you learn it and you read it and you're told about it, and then you're given ways to play it so that it reaches better that point. Take it with this hand, divide this voice with this, try this, depending of each individual hand's size stretch. One size doesn't fit all, technically, nor intellectually. And if a student seeks for something because they have perhaps in the piece of music they play an intuitive thought about it that is clear but not for every element of the piece. In other words, you have the essence and the form. And so you have to know how to inhabit the piece, how to deal with the transitions, how to delay or prepare the effects. If you see crescendo, do you play loud or do you delay it? And until when? Do all crescendi reach a climax? Or when it's not a climax, is it just fragmented, or is it just an anti-climax in the sense of the flow, instead of just perhaps broken in many pieces statement, like a puzzle without all the pieces? And some pieces are just linear in their emotional, melodic, harmonic thought process, and others are so thought-provoking that they're either rejected, either when the acquired taste is developed by curiosity, studying, learning, reading, discovering how other people see it, how other people rejected it, how other people misunderstood it. So then you create your own pantheon inside you and saying, oh, I'm more comfortable with this classical period, but no, I only play romantic, or I don't believe in all this emotional sentimentalism. I prefer modern music because it is, and it's true that at all levels of styles and expressions, the intelligence of the author's thought behind the organization of the elements, the structuring of the choices of the, like, to organize the chaos of nature, it's very appealing. Intelligence is appealing. Charismatic intelligence is appealing, sometimes negatively when it's not positive humanistically. But nevertheless, it is appealing. People have this kind of, when I say sense of admiration, it could appear a fanatization. It could be that it's then in a situation where one can admire evil idols. Equally as one admires, by the technique of admiration, people who are benefactors of humanity, scientifically, artistically, I don't know, whichever way. So it doesn't exonerate me of a critical sense to have this openness to this true sense, I hope, that I live up to my expectations of tolerance. And if I say all these things and I share them, is because I think that we all build some kind of necessary protection shield of societal situations, of we build a certain backbone of our know-how, through our know-how of what we do when we dispense it. At all levels, if it's a good craftsman, if it's a good artist, if it's a good meaning, if it's a honest and sincere and constantly trying to improve person, not in words or in attitudes, but in their acts. The dissatisfaction with this until I find the reason for that. As the scientists, especially medical scientists, they always proceed by elimination in order to reach the diagnosis of what you have. I think when I teach, I also try to do that. I don't immediately reject and say, no, your way is wrong because it's not mine, or mine is his, the composer's, and I am in dialogue with the composer. I like to joke with that when I teach, because I find it to be more true, in fact, other than, tell students some kind of reading from my mind articles and be, sort of say, conferencing constantly with my knowledge or my convictions. Rather get from one detail to another and say, I think the composer told me one day that he didn't go there because he went this way and that led him to this, and if he had done that, and then I give the example, you would have expected this. So, of course, you don't teach a student how to play a masterpiece by explaining the masterpiece, questioning the masterpiece's intents. And, of course, it's almost archaeologically interesting to go into the manuscript, handwriting, first, second, third draft, if there were any. Mozart, unfortunately for us, gave directly the final draft, so we don't have visually how to see the evolution of the layers of the thought process, what you cut, what is too long, what you develop, what you decide. You know what is wrong, as I said, as a composer, but you don't always know what's right. But you define it by knowing what is not. So I guess it's also producing a thought process search for the cause by elimination, like medical doctors. And then comes the point where you realize that, and you should not expect them to hear the piece before they played, to read the piece analytically as you did, or you reached a point where you did, because you didn't always do. And so they come to you at a season of your life where you've reached a certain awareness that can easily become rigidity, because you want to dispense something that they can trust you with, and you cannot constantly answer by a question if they ask you a question. How am I supposed to do this? Am I supposed to use the repeat? And what does it mean to play a trill in Baroque music or in romantic music? How am I supposed to play it? And I can give argumentation. I can say, I love it this way. Or I can say, this is supposed to be because that's the tradition. But the tradition that I received is not the tradition another person received. Of course, they will consult other doctors, teachers. And they will perhaps get confused why the same piece means so many different things to so many very supposedly knowledgeable musicians. So it can ultimately lead a student to be lost in translation, so to say, by this amount of translations that exist, literally interpretations in the literal form of the word. It's translation from the Dead Scroll to the live music, ephemeral as it is. Then even if it's recorded, even if it's published, even if it's available for comparison, even if you can have technologically access to variety of fingerings of different editors, is not just your teacher, serendipitously happen to be where you are in the tradition that you receive, which is also serendipitously the one you receive. You don't decide when you're a child prodigy or when you're a young student or a young 20-something human, which line of thought you're going to develop your own way of thinking. It somehow happens by the place and the time where you are. And some people question the status quo to the point to which they're able to really go against the wave. And that is hard intellectually and sometimes motivated by their personality. You cannot isolate the intellect from the character of the personality or the innate DNA way of their being since birth, because after all, that's the unicity, the beauty of humans, is that we are all, while of course enormously communal, we have incredible individualities, from the fingerprints to our way of thinking, evolving, changing. Of course, is a fragility of being, the vulnerability of being, that makes us hold on to truths that solidify something against which we feel like we can depend of, intellectually, financially, socially. And some people attach such an importance to it by itself. You know, it is true that I admire people who can reach to become very rich, or people who I admire people who become extremely influential because they manage to think the world in ways before the others do. And also I fear people who mislead people. So in order to remain true to oneself, one has to be first curious, open-minded, truly, not fakely, and then have a conviction, because you know by the craftsmanship of your thought process, not the thought process itself, which could be a different point of view from a different person and could be older or younger. I admire past and future generations. I admire students and children of mine, as well as peers and ancestors of mine, musically, artistically, or just family. It's not about the generation, it's to accept that their point of view will enrich the world by their presence on earth. We don't know how, and we don't want to think about it because it seems like we're philosophizing every day like that, and we do nothing except talk like I just did, do to you now. But in fact, what I meant is that the technique which I can help them, the craftsmanship through which I can help them develop their own artistry away from my own aesthetic or within my own aesthetic, if it is, then I consider them disciples. Not because it pleases me that they believe in what I entered believing in the way of doing my art or serving my trade, is because I think that truly in a fundamental craftsman approach, it works. And if it works, I want them to work for them. Because if you eliminate in a performance of a piano piece the elements which create the uncertainty that with luck it might happen, it's like there's so many obstacles and some I'll plan and some I hope go through in some kind of sequence of events of good luck. We need good luck, but you place yourself in the position for it when you have covered a lot of the elements of the technical approach, from fingerings to dispositions of the hands and how to anticipate the thought of the very section in which you enter before you enter in it, instead of easing into it, and by the times you leave it for the next section, it's almost like one train behind. So if I can bring the students the fruits of my own reflection about handling the piece literally for a pianist, that's interesting. The ergonomy, in that sense, of the way of approaching, of sculpting the keyboard abstraction of the sounds that we obtain from the instrument, or we hope to obtain, because they never come out exactly like we imagine them in our inner idealized world, and matching the inner ear with the monitored ear, matching the intent of what we think the composer did through the filter of the notation, which is often our own real connection to the piece, other than the ear for hearing it how other people understood what this intent was. And then we can like to combine them and say, oh, I like the piece, but through the performance of this performer, and then I'll try to adapt it from there as a template. In fact, the pedagogy is to obviously bring a template to be for them to use as a launching board, but it shouldn't be an end by itself. And if imitation is part of the game, rejection is also part of the game. If it's polite, they don't do it in front of you. They do it after the lesson. If they came to seek a lesson from you, they might not absorb all, or even if they want, they might not remember all, because it's a plethora of details that creates even one element, let less all together. It's a construction of patience, of drive because of your love for it. So you keep doing on and on until you improve to manage craftsman-like the artistry of the piece. And you realize the more you do, compared to when you did without to know about it, that you might never reach it. And if I say it will take you 25 years to play this section convincingly in a piece, it sounds extremely either arrogantly said, or it's not meant, but it could appear for a student to be discouraging if it's taken at face value. And then I have to immediately explain why I'm saying that, because I say you nourish yourself from your life's experiences, from other repertoires that are unrelated to the one that you studied, to which you'll go back to, having been enriched by the others. And you don't know how and why and which detail will trigger, highlight, make you play better the piece of another time. But that's, I think, what is the beauty of life, is to accept that. Every day is the only day, every lesson is the only lesson, and every other lesson is the only lesson. Not because you forget the preceding ones, or you don't want to project yourself in future ones, but because you want to reach temporary truths about tempo, phrasing, articulation, dynamics, pedal, or plural, pedals, understanding of the meaning of the piece from its point of view, then your own point of view in it, and how other people play it differently from you. And when a student tells you, I heard such and such do this and that in it, and it's not the way I think it, I try to not explain or justify my approach, or to try to give the illusion that I have some kind of superiority on the student because I have the experience. I'm just at the different, as I said, season of life. I remain a student in front of the piece in its idealized situation of keep on learning, because we have accepted to understood and accepted that we'll never get to the bottom of things enough. But because they are intriguing mysteriously us, or they are appealing, or they are seducing us, and we want to be at the level of the expectation of the pantheon on which we place the piece in our own esteem, therefore admiration, again the word that I like to believe is a driver. You admire a piece you want to serve. You admire a piece you would like to compose, like, regardless if it's presumptuous to even think it, let's say it. And unfortunately, most of the time, believe it. Humor is good for humility. But nevertheless, without the capacity to admire your spouse, to admire your partner, to admire, you can dislike, criticize, you reject, but still admire. The human person is not one single simple entity. It's contradictory entity. It's the humanity in ourselves that is contradictory. And this contradiction is our vulnerability, but also our strength. Perhaps our inconsistency. We try to want to be consistent, but our humanity at different levels for different people is at different amounts. Perhaps doesn't allow us to reach the goal. We could understand it intellectually, but to implement it, it demands such abnegation of self-improvement through constant criticism of oneself that one reaches a point where one loses entirely self-esteem by realizing that I'm worthless and the piece is endless, and in terms of reaching it. No, you're worth every minute. You're worth every second of you attempting it. You're making the world a more harmonious world. A Bach fugue doesn't solve a war situation, but a Bach fugue brings to understand a system in which equal voices harmoniously layered or combined or crossing each other coexist. And you learn from an artwork something about your behavior in life with a person, in your personal life. Okay, you don't live an artwork life in daily life, but nevertheless, they are guiding principles that you capture from an artwork, or its intent, or what you receive from it. And even if you misread it or misunderstand the book's point that you read it, but it somehow inspired you to do something else which has its own meaning on its own, unrelated to the subject of the book in question, but it's the behaving in applying all what your stay on earth, from the vulnerable beginnings to the fragile end, whenever that occurs, you have this impression that everything that nourishes your spirit, your mind, and your body, obviously, and your desires and your hopes and your yearnings and your impatiences and your frustrations and your discouragements because you're not considered and you don't get to go to that school or to that job or to that line of thought, of line of work, or line of, and you're not appreciated for all what you bring, and some people cheat and they're more appreciated. You see it, they don't see it. People from outside don't get it or don't care, which is even worse, but it's fact. And so the injustice of the world or the injustice of a small situation revolts you in your own personality. Other people do conflict resolution by even avoiding it before it happens, perhaps in denial, in order to not get hurt, and say, okay, I'm just that, but I'll pursue my little path on life. I cannot solve the situations that eventually appall me about unfairnesses in the world at all levels, not just hunger, but also education, but also all these situations in which you feel like, okay, I'm doing my little part, even if it's a drop in an ocean. Therefore, that's the humility. To think that we are somehow individually, or even collectively sometimes, changing the course of the way people think things. Of course, not everybody invents the light bulb, and not everybody invents the new tonal system or atonal system or serial system. These are the thinkers. Not everybody can think the theory of relativity. Not everybody can reject it if they have the capacity to do so, because science is based on rejecting preceding mistaken understandings of the mysteries of the universe. In music, Schumann doesn't cancel Mozart, who doesn't cancel Bach. They just accumulate differently. Perhaps people can say, rightfully, I hate this, I prefer that, or I misunderstand rather one, but they like to say don't like. And then same with performers. Or I don't like Chopin by Naumov, or I prefer, I don't know, Prokofiev by Argerich. But of course, I do too. That's why I have this capacity of admiration. I'm not blinded by it. I'm not blinded by my admiration, but I place it in people whom I feel have a substance. Perhaps I misread other people. Perhaps people misread me. We all are misread by people. And perhaps for their own shortcomings or my own shortcomings. In front of the vastitude of the mistakes one can make that have or more or less consequences in behaviors, in perceptions of oneself or perceptions of others by oneself, in a competitive field, it's very hard. Especially when I place myself as a mentor, trusted advisor for their career or their playing technique or their way of expressing themselves. I know that they come to me as students to go from the perhaps letter D to E. They already have ABC and they'll go FG and they'll complete the alphabet on their own, so to say, metaphorically. As we all do in a certain way. But true humility is like true humor. Is it possible to really accept humor about oneself? Hard. Is it a lack of self-esteem to accept anything about oneself? Possibly. So where do you place the threshold or the thermometer between humility and modesty, tolerance, and then conviction, and then imposition of the conviction, even if you're doing it because you know it's the right way, because you've proven it through your experience, and if the student trusts you, then you can give it without any feel that or fear that that way will be misunderstood. And the students say, but you misled me. And ultimately, as a child would do growing up, a student grows up, they do grow up to reject. Ravel was not the perfect orthodox disciple of Fauré. But Ravel was so admired by Fauré, who was his teacher, of course. And the quartet made him write his own so much later because he self-censored himself because his student Ravel wrote such masterpiece of contrapoint when he was his student. Same with Haydn, seeing in Mozart his spiritual son, Mozart writing his quartets, calling them Haydn's children. it wasn't attitude, it was just, I guess you can say they recognized each other intuitively or by affective election. Intellectual affective election could be sentimental. I think it's all part of it. Sentimental affective election of a person's charisma being amazement that produces in you their personality, because you feel like with them you're constantly awaken. You're in a you feel like, oh, I want to be with this person because I feel perhaps I become more intelligent or become more sensitive or understand better certain things. Not all of us allow in our own inner world to accept saying that to ourselves, but really that's what it is, admiration. A capacity to admire somebody who does something that you will never do, an astronaut, an athlete, and perhaps the astronaut or the athlete don't yearn in admiration of somebody playing a trill on the piano, which seems self-evident but difficult, or a specific gesture in classical ballet that seems so effortless by the essence of their art form. But we know it's not, but that's not the point. It's the art form is to erase the effort in that case of the ballet. And if you watch a wrestling game, then the effort is part of the aesthetics of it. So you cannot say one is more valuable than the other. I can admire a wrestler as well as a philosopher or a classic dancer, and I will never be any of them just because physically or intellectually or all of it, it's just not me. But that doesn't mean that I, as a person, have to identify with the person I admire. Of course, as a fan, that happens often with an idol. I agree. But in this case, it's an admiration for a way of being of a student, of a child, of a descendant. And I find this admiration to be a good fuel for one's daily life, without which, if you live with a partner by obviously mutual election, for how long that can last, which is another of the problems that have to be faced by one of the two partners when that happens. It's rare that both enter in connection and disconnect at the same time. It's always a dissociation of that. But if you don't, of course you can say, I love the partner, I love the way they are, and then progressively you can start criticizing the way they are. But because there's so many aspects to a human, you can like a human or love a human for something, and at the same time hate acts of this human, or even condemn them and reject them and reject the way this person acts, but still have some kind of admiration or perhaps full admiration for the way they are, either in their trade, either in their thought. Not all the greatest artists that we admire were great human beings. As a matter of fact, some were dreadful human beings. If you take this as the thermometer of your admiration, if you only have to admire people who are admirable human beings, incredible creators if they were in their field, and at the same time lived a life that was extremely pious or extremely generous, extremely selfless, and does that make it a quality per itself? I'm not so sure, but I think it's something to admire when you see somebody being selfless. Ultimately, I still believe when you love a human being, you are selfless because you love them, of course, for what they bring to you. So there is a selfishness in receiving the love that you receive in mirror from the person who you are electing for your affections. Philosophically, you can admire them separately from the way you love them. And if you don't admire them, even if you love them, at some point it doesn't last enough to hold with the details of everyday lives, shortcomings, where you start accumulating the amount of details that you dislike, that the whole picture drops down and you say, no, I don't love you. And I can say the same thing, therefore, with teaching compositions of dead composers, being very alive in the present of the teaching it. It's not just a historic museum art piece that I present to them and say, look at it, how pretty it is, close the box, put it back in the window display. Not at all. We are breaking eggs, we're making omelette every day, buttering the elements to reach the fusion of the elements that we think is what was supposed to be the piece in the either thoughts of the composer, either as how it's accepted by the musical society of today. So we are not just there learning how to reproduce skills, we are thinking how to do it on our own. And the human individuality brings the combination of the ingredients to a new taste result. And of course, you have people who forget the preceding generations, because people, of course, are mortal, and not all were preserved. Like, we don't know how Mozart played his music. We assume the grace note was half the value or not. And this is a technical detail. It doesn't justify the whole thing. Did Bach finish with a retenue to all his pieces, or did he not? Because most of them don't finish on a downbeat. Does the notation give us a hint about this kind of agogic, which is in music really the syntax of things? Or do we have to learn a foreign language with its own syntax to understand their own myths, to understand their own hints behind and besides the words they used? And so a translation of a text can be a complete misleading. And who pretends to be authentic, or who pretends to understand better than the others what it is, was, or was supposed to be, or was. Situations, thoughts, and positioning myself at my very small level next to these giants of music whom I teach through their works to the students keeps me inevitably humble. Every time I think I'll replay the piece and reach the moment of the legato that will be exactly the level that it's supposed to be, not too much, not less. How do you define the right taste, the right level, the right color, the right transition, the right change of tempo that brings you through the texture, not just the pulse, not the metronome, not just because of the notation, but the flow, the essence of the storytelling. How do you space the words, the notes, the pitches? How you, with the pedal, manage to combine some that were not meant to be, but they're attractive to do so. And do you do it just by intuition, or just the fleeing moment that sort of brings you to do it? And you don't have to justify it to yourself when you play by yourself the piece, because you sort of enter in some kind of internal dialogue with the piece, what you're told not to do in it, or how much you want to do in it. And I shouldn't slow down, I shouldn't rush, I shouldn't play too loud, I shouldn't get too early in that spot, because the structure allows me to prepare. I have to reach the given dynamic range at a given amount of bars. All these strategic patterns that we involve in our teaching are sort of mapping the path with the piece, and every time you play it, it reveals itself slightly differently just because of your human being. You're never the same temper, mood every day at the same time, even if you try to organize it, if you try to society and the systems make us all become reproducing the days as if they were always planned and happened the way they were planned, and in fact they all appear to be meaninglessly the same. Or then if they're disturbingly different, then we are lost as well. So is it reassuring to manage to control the chaos of situation, or do you get fueled by the chaos that you try to, if not organize, perhaps adopt as an attitude to say, I'll deal with the unexpected, call it chaos or not. I'm not going to just lock in all the interpretational tools so that nothing ever happens. The piece will choke under my control or my desire to control it, because in fact you never control it. But the fact that we go through the piece repetitively, but the audience hears it once, is that all the other times the audience didn't hear, like they didn't watch the rehearsals of the orchestra, the practicing of the gymnastics, sports people. I mean, we assume there is preparation, but we like to believe that there is a spontaneous storytelling, even if we know that art is artificial, or artificial imitation of life, right, itself. And so we believe the actor because we want the actor to, in a selfless way, enter in the character which they inhabit, and therefore the storytelling of the character becomes our connection through the embodiment by the actor of it. And we cannot think of it by another actor but the one we saw if the storytelling was so charismatically, clearly, or beautifully, or deeply touching us. And then we can say same with the interpretation. I like it only by this pianist and not by another. But perhaps I don't know the piece so much on its own. And perhaps the piece is proteiformic anyway. It's supposed to be transformed by everybody who plays it into something else. And is it limitless? Perhaps. Perhaps some people think it's limitless. I personally think that it's all in the subtle details. Oh, subtle details, which highlight the whole in a way that it reveals you another truth about the piece or the movement or the section, whatever you call it, the phrase, the modulation, the essence of the being of a section musically, and how it inserts itself in the whole, and how you detail practice it in order to fulfill everything in it. Why? Because you admire the piece, again, admiration, and you don't want to fail the piece, and then you don't want to fail it in front of your peers or judges, you don't want to fail it in front of your own self-esteem, you don't want to fail it in front of your colleagues, and even if you're in competition, you have to accept that you can fail, and you have to try, but if you don't, then you won't take a risk. And if you don't take the risk, then you fuel some kind of fantasy of the piece, and therefore you end up believing nobody can play it well, no matter what. So then you admire the piece beyond those who serve it. Nobody finds justice in your judgmental, critical thoughts. And it's justified very often individually by each of us who have our critical sense. In fact, we cannot not build an interpretation in music without making choices about what we don't do. How we don't play in a given style, a dynamic range, an ornamented decoration, or how we implement it for its meaning in the storytelling itself. Is the decoration more emotionally expressive than the note that it decorates? Or is the note that decorates needing to be brought out more so even with the decay of the instrument sound, like the piano? Because musically it's intended in a tension before a future release of the dissonance to a consonance, but the sound itself decays. We are in denial of it. And so we try to organize it when we listen, because I objectively listen to the students when I teach subjective opinion, and I say, hey, I hear you, but you didn't bring that, even if they thought they already did, not enough, perhaps too much, but they thought not at all. And how come when I thought I was doing it? Do they have a different perception next to me on the next piano when they play than me? As the dancer teacher who sees the gestures in the mirror, as well as the classic dancer practicing in front of the mirror at the lesson, do they perceive differently the gesture? Do they accept that the criticism is true and that they really didn't do the gesture to its fullest? But they monitor at the same time with their eyes as here you do with the ears. So it's not just the playing you want to improve as a teacher through the technique and the philosophy of the piece, it's the very hearing of the piece. It's the very hearing of the composer's ideas, how they heard the combinations of the sounds, and how that is transformed if the instrument is not the one for which they intended it, or they couldn't hear it other. And perhaps with presumption, I assume that the Bach fugue is perhaps on the piano for the long values that are decaying longer than on the harpsichord, or so you hear them better, the polyphonies, because they don't decay. But when they decay, you express them by articulations variety. And if you play it on the organ, you hear only the long values because it doesn't decay in the pipes of the air. Then the decorations are heard in the background, the harpsichord in the foreground. On the piano, you can make the choice. So then all of a sudden, you're invested for a certain genre to play on an instrument that allows you to shape the texture illimitlessly. It's incredible. Other instruments talk to you and tell you what they can do. If you play on a Flemish, Italian Baroque, or French Baroque on a German harpsichord, it doesn't come out stylistically as it's supposed to be. But even if you don't go into that and you just decide to say that, in fact, we should only play music on the instrument on which it was composed, but therefore the ears that heard it, therefore for the mentality of the time that didn't hear other levels of dissonant consonances that came in later times. In idiot chronology, of course, we can say that Chopin never heard Debussy. Obviously, Debussy heard Chopin. Did that influence Debussy? In part. Did Brahms influence Debussy? Not. Did Brahms or Mozart in the late life or Liszt as a composer write music that started diverging from their original style? Were they visionaries, or were they just intuitively understanding that they enter in other trends when others like Poulenc didn't? And I think it doesn't make them lesser great. I love Poulenc's music, and imagining him sitting listening to the Boulez Sonata as he did, he must have been literally confronted to something intellectually for his trade insane. It's such a break of language revolution, which sometimes the human psyche doesn't get, let alone the brain. It's not just a stylistic trend change, it's a change of paradigm, a change of alphabet, a change of everything. And that was because of the lifespan of composers of the 18th century, 17th century, which was relatively short to our days, but also in their own days for some, after all. We'll never know the Schubert sonatas in his 70s of age, because we don't know what he would have become in terms of the formal development or evolution. We don't know what Mozart would have written later, and how they would have been shocked to hear things. When Haydn heard Beethoven because Haydn survived almost 20 years, Mozart having been, of course, his senior, and Mozart having been literally, as I like to say, and I just did, I think, spiritual son. Beethoven was not a spiritual son of Haydn. Beethoven was the first Viennese school barrier. He killed it, he broke it, at least formally. Of course, we can say he revolutionized it, he developed it, he opened the doors to Romanticism, where the essence breaks a way to express itself from the form, and Haydn was the mastering of the form within which, with perfect balance of elements, you fit everything in. So it's all about the organization of the thought with the essence of the expression. And in the Romanticism, as it develops into modernity towards the beginning of the 20th century, it was a constant process, apparently, for some more forward, some back, and then forwards, like tango steps, two forward, one behind. Not always forward all way, but nevertheless, it reached the point where Beethoven already early broke that form in his late works. But if Beethoven, let's say, died young, like Mozart or Schubert or Weber or those people who brought themselves to a point where they were still within their time, even if they were misunderstood for some aspects of their music writing. Beethoven, in his late works, was very controversial in his situation, like the fugue for string quartet and so on. But since it wasn't given to most of them to live enough to see the stylistic evolution, and then of course Bach never heard Bartok and so on, that is so evident. But we play it on the piano, and because the piano is versatile instrument enough to play anything and things written even not for the piano, for instance Bach, but you don't play a Rachmaninoff concerto on the harpsichord for evident reasons. And so if it's not the instrument, then it's the hearing, then it's the culture, then it's the sensitivity towards a specific genre, style, time period. I still believe you can be authentically driven as well as translating it in modern tools without to be contradictory. You can like it side by side, so to say. You don't reject it by saying it should never be played this way or on this instrument because it's not on which was invented. I still think of the creators, in fact, they thought like Da Vinci built tanks and helicopters in his drawings way before they're technologically able to be built. But he drew them. Beethoven imagined piano sonatas in his 30s because that's also coincided with the arrival full-fledged industrially of the fortepiano compared to the harpsichord. But the mentality of the harpsichord composers composing for the piano, it's also their own evolution. But you cannot have the same as people who start directly with the new. And then they develop it. And what does Beethoven write in his 32 sonatas? Mostly string quartet genres, arias genres. In other words, it is instrumental, like on the harpsichord, the dances of the Baroque dances suites, or the arias, but then you write fugues, which are pure music, not imitation of other genres on the keyboard. And that same thing with the tone poems, the ballades, the fantasies, and then the expression of more and more scarce elements without developing or without repeating, the necessity of the recapitulation, the rejection of the form, the modernity. The modernity is always, of course, fleeing because it's already past as soon as it happened. But we can trace some of the situations and say, you know, we have a Stravinsky, and before we had a Tchaikovsky, and the one is more traditional, the other one is less. But really the same side of the coin, but it depends how you look at the coin. And I think that unless one specializes in one art form, in one time period, as a literature buff or a film buff or I don't know, Baroque music buff or romantic music buff or classical music buff. In classical music, so many trends, so many styles, so many time periods that it's difficult to even mention them, let less organize them because some overlap, but most of them at some point break through something that was a transgression to the past. And so what was a dissonance for Monteverdi, it was a consonance for Debussy. And what is dissonant for consonant for Debussy was dissonant for others. So it's always a question not of innovation or only breaking the status quo. It's rethinking the purpose of the organization of the sounds by themselves. Like a poem is beautiful also by the choice of the words, be they common, because you can use them in daily life for other purposes or even the same purposes, but the way they're organized, the way they are rhythmed, the way they are paced, they convey a poetic purpose, not always a meaning directly to be understood. That's the mystery, the beauty of poetry. But the sound of the words themselves matter, which makes poetry literally untranslatable, since the essence of the meaning and the coding of the way you mean it are intended to be in the sounds that you produce when you say it. when you put it in your mouth as an actor or as a storyteller. And you can sing an opera phonetically because you don't have to learn all the languages. You have to learn the words of the role that you sing in the opera. Of course, you learn on the side the storytelling of the opera, but ultimately, if you want to enter in the depths of the subtleties, of the hints, of the innuendos of any art form, you have to immerse yourself in it authentically. So the language matters. Can you learn a language for each book that you want to read? If it's in a different language, you'll read some, but mostly by translations. Of course, you have better translators than others, and that is an art form on its own, exactly like interpretation is, which is what it is ultimately. It's a translation. And sometimes a transcription can bring the piece to sound not only differently because it's intended for a different instrument or group of instruments, but then it has a parallel life of its own and its own truth that it's revealed, and people like to hear it. Mussorgsky Pictures, for instance, is obvious. It's a piano piece and everybody wanted to orchestrate it, and did, more or less everybody, but more than most of pieces was orchestrated so many times. Is that the piece has this blossoming effect that gives in constantly so much, and we feel like if we lock in the interpretation of this sonata this way, with this tradition, on this instrument, with this tempo, because of this editor and this musicologist who defined this, and this is the right tradition, and this is the right way. Okay, you give that frame to the student, and what do they do with it? Ultimately, they'll break it, intuitively or intellectually, either by rejecting what you taught them, either parts of what you taught them, the way you want it there to play, the legato, non-legato, air legato, wet legato, staccato, not totally detached but connected in the thought, or detached just for the comic effect, or detached because of an anxiety interrupted short air breath. We don't breathe to play the piano, but we imitate breathing, long or short. We don't sing on the piano, but we imitate the length of a vibrato of the voice holding the sound. So are all pianists in denial that they're not singers? I think they are. Chopin, among many, most inspiring one. Does the instrument allow us more what the musical intends, and that we transform it, and we can say then, why don't we then reinvent the piano through an electronic instrument for the aesthetic purposes, not just the practical, which it is. Doesn't get out of tune, can be placed anywhere, it's lighter to transport, but it doesn't have the flair, the taste, the charm of the real instrument with all the defects. It can be out of tune, but you feel the real thing happening, the vibration of the strings, not just synthesized. So the synthesis of the sound is great. It gives you the reality for a composer to hear it before they have the chance financially to afford to have a rehearsal of an orchestra, which costs more than a car. For a few hours, as people can't spend this fortune just to hear how it sounds. So inevitably, the synthesized systems allow a lot of progress for the technical approach of music making, composing for film, hearing things without musicians. But ultimately, when you hear the soundtrack of the orchestra playing in the film, you hear the reality, at least for now. Perhaps with the future technology advances, the believability of the artificial synthetic orchestra compared to the real musicians, the vibrato, the glissando, the very individual way of playing, even if matching the pitches, the intonation, and the intensity to create something together communally, it's still some of the individualities, not just a synthesized system that you can just... But I don't think that the modern piano necessarily needs to be improved technologically, because it allows for such variety of interpretations, highlighting the sounds, differently voicing, bringing out this, layering that. You have the instrument as such, but then the way you play it is different from the other person. When you attend a jury of international piano competition, they play the same instrument and they sound like different people. Do they have different fingers? Yes. Do they have different... no, of course, generally they have the, of course, physiological structure of human being. But is it their hearing, their inner hearing, that allows them to bring out something in the piece through their playing that we hear from outside and say, oh, this piece was revealed to me by this performer. That's the sense of admiration I like to talk about. To have a piece revealed to you, and then you're admiring the person who revealed it to you, or the group of people who revealed it to you. Or perhaps you ignored it before, perhaps you misunderstood it before, perhaps you rejected it or disliked it for good or bad reasons before, and all of a sudden, you understand or love it, and perhaps don't really know how much of each, and it's revealed to you, and you're admiring, saying, wow. Of course, the admiration comes also at the same time, if it's in the same field, with a certain desolation. You feel like, I'll never make it to the level of this performer, but doesn't stop me from admiring the performer. And if it's in another field which is so foreign to you, you just admire, as well as the, let's say, achievement, if it is to be called so, as well as the field of the achievement that you admire. I wish to always know more about this or that, and nobody can have known enough things about everything, or most things, let less everything. Yeah, I think admiration is to do with revelation daily.